No? Okay. So we're going to continue talking about psychology of training, and we are going to talk about some important issues, but they are not like what should come next after near transfer. It's just something that we should go back focusing on them because they're prerequisite to talk about what we should talk about, the difference between near and far transfer. So it's like more broad issues of science of training in general, and it's focused on its psychology. So this thing that you see on the right side, it's the psychology logo or whatever. It's psi, Greek letter. And one key assumption that we assume in the science of training is that anything you do, all of your activities, anything that you can think of, that you're conscious or even unconscious, even when you're sleeping, all of them affect your future performance, can affect your future performance. And it's in a way that you may not recognize that, but it does. So that's the basic assumption of training, that you don't have to be in a training program or in a training simulator. But anything you do, like your hobbies, your interests, anything, can change your way of doing things in future. Or that skill or that interest that you develop when doing that, that might be transferable to certain skills that you're not aware of. Now, one question that I have is, what do we mean by that? Like in a broad picture, especially in the context of training, why is it important? Why should we think about that?
This when you be thinking about training, it tends to be a higher level of emotional response.
Yes, yes, emotional response. And your name, please? Okay. Yes, exactly. If you think about it like as anything that you might be, that is contextual, that is not directly relevant to anything, is about your hobbies or anything that you might follow emotionally or anything, that affects your future performance. Any other thought or questions? What is that?
The amount of effort. So like if you're always lazy,
Okay. Yes, the amount of effort. And of course, if you spend a lot of effort in certain things, it's more likely for you to develop skills in that thing, and you get better in that specific task or skill, or because that task is the skill in that task might be transferable to other tasks, you might also get better at other things. So this kind of shows the importance of things that you might consider as not important, your hobbies or anything that you care about, that you're interested in, but nonetheless, they affect the detail of your future performance or your job or anything that you might have, or your education. Any other? Yes, it's basically these questions of what are you doing right now? You're sitting in class, listening to a lecture, probably learning something, or what were you doing before you came to the class, walking, before that doing something, or watching something in your home or dorm, or anything that might constitute your daily activities. What you're doing, what you're going to do after the class, anything that's in your mind, that you're projecting yourself that I'm going to do this after the class, you have some ideas about that. So your pastime or hobby, whether being playing a computer game or reading a book or playing a sport, basically all of your pastime or hobbies that you can think of. What do you usually think before going to sleep? It's can be activity or anything that you're getting better at, or your future goals or plans. or if you have a goal in mind, or if you have a job or had a job in the past, even if that job is something that you think does not require that much experience and skill, what you learn in that job affects your future performance in certain things. And this is important because if you think about it, usually when you want to do some bigger scale projects or in your future jobs, suddenly you think, oh, I've gained these skills that now I'm using that you never predicted before. That you say, oh, for example, I learned about this thing in school, or I had this experience as a child, and now I see that I'm using that. And even if you do not remember that, it's affecting your current performance at the time. Or if you have helped your friend or relative or grandparents in doing things, even that. Any other activity that you can think of, like fixing your bicycle or reading books, what kind of books, and all of that. Even listening to music or the type of music that you listen to. Each time you listen to that music, something's changing in you. It's kind of practicing. And that's why, for example, you see certain people that have a trained ear for music. They can recognize good and bad music. So what you need to keep in mind is that anything you do and your current skills, or who you are as in terms of your capabilities, are what is a result of what you did in the past. The places you were, people that you had interaction with, the activities that you had. And so if you just extend this notion into the future, you can conclude that your future can also depend on what you do now and by that time. These are general common sense things, but they are nonetheless the basis of what we know as training. And as we mentioned, this is almost everything that you do. This includes everything. If you work out in gym, or if you fix your bicycle, anything that you can think of. And the reason that I'm reviewing these is because we might not be conscious of what's happening to us when we're doing something. But it is changing something in us unconsciously. It's developing some skill in our unconscious that might change our future skill in doing other things. So for example, if your parents or grandparents or any of your relatives listen to certain types of music or classical music when you were a child, you unconsciously have this in the back of your head. Your ear is to some extent trained, and you might understand or have a better chance of understanding classical music, or you can start from now and listening to that. I know that in younger people or like high school people, like students, or the majority of people are not that much familiar or do not like classical music. It sounds boring. It sounds like not cool, but it all depends on how much your ear is trained. If you understand it, if you have extended time listening to that music, to that classical music of, say, certain period, then you know, oh, now I see why it's important, why it's the basis of music in general, classical music. Or if you have had any experience of being in a classical concert, it might give you a better chance of training on that kind of listening to and understanding classical music. Or even programming. If you grew up liking computer stuff and working with computer, working with different softwares, and I've seen people starting programming as a hobby, as something that they do in their pastime, just working with their computer, opening some software, even simple software, and just creating simple programs, like something like a calculator. And this gives them an advantage when they grow up, because most of the jobs, many of the jobs at least nowadays, need someone to know programming, or if you know programming, that's a plus for you. And usually those people are those that have a better chance of becoming experts in programming, because they like it, they started it as a hobby, and they practice that somehow unconsciously. So do you have any question about this broad picture of anything we do affects almost anything we do in the future? Okay. So, as I said, it seems very like common sense, it's true, but it's helpful to think in terms of like what you do, to be conscious of what you do and to be careful of what you do, and to know that this affects your skills for future. So if we think about what factors determine or what factors determine your habitual activities or your habits, we can think of your natural interests, or in social sciences terms or psychology terms, genetic factors, and your environment, like people around you, or whatever happened or whatever was in your surrounding when you were a child, and what your parents used to do, for example, your friends, their interests, activities that you do together, things that you care about together. So your hobbies, interests, extracurricular activities, they're mostly determined by genes and environment, or by your nature and nurture. So if you want to keep it in mind, like in short lessons, all of your activities are important because they might affect your future performance, simply because they change you. They change something in you. The change might not be noticeable, but it's nonetheless a change that when they accumulate over time, you see that it somehow determines a person's capabilities. Now, if you look at the second sentence, it says, your activities change you consciously or unconsciously. Now, the question is, what do you think about this, I would say, important question of the difference here between the conscious and unconscious? What do we mean by that?
So I'd say unconsciously, like things like music or things like games with like that impact our behaviors without us realizing.
And your name?
Michael.
Yes. So, yes, exactly. Things that we are interested in, and we do it just as something or anything. We nonetheless learn that And this process is unconscious because we do not intend to get training on that task, but we do it and it gets better. Any other?
I'd say for consciously, like go to a class, say a math class, and learning and stuff.
Mhm.
You need to train that.
Yes, those are conscious things that you are tasked with something or you're responsible, or you have to pass certain classes to get a degree. So you have to go and you have to be conscious of whatever is, especially in classroom context. Those are the things that usually facts or things that the person should learn. Most of it is conscious. Yes?
Jesse, I was just gonna say that for consciously, like I feel like you have to put in that. Whatever you're trying to remember. And for unconscious, like, I feel like most of the time we just like what you do, so.
Okay.
Just unconsciously what that's doing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Usually, especially if you think about what we talked about previously about the classroom context, many times, many students in many classes are not interested in the material that's being taught, but they just sit there to pass the course. That's a reality. And that's what they have to do. And they have to put some more effort compared to if they were sitting in class that they were really interested, they could connect to the materials, and that would happen without that much effort. So this process of unconscious might play a role here because they don't have to put much effort in it. It's just happen automatically. Yes?
This would apply for more cursory. Would apply for more physical tasks, visual. So anything that we physically do could build up some muscle memory that's invaluable with users.
Yes, yes. Physical activities or muscle memory or motor skills, those are the type of skills that are often known as unconscious because say you learn driving. What you're doing is certain behaviors from your hand, head, legs. So, but you're not conscious of what you're doing. If you know driving and you want to tell someone else how to drive, it's really difficult to say exactly consciously what steps you follow, but you just do that. And those are more likely, like physical things or motor skills are more likely to be unconscious.
I just like realize the difference feels like for conscious training, like usually it's like we actively make a decision or we wish something to happen in the future. But for unconscious, it's more like we can only discover after we have a change that caused by unconscious change.
So if you have to make a decision at a certain point, or at least certain types of decisions, it's more likely for you to be conscious of the options because you have options and you cannot be unconscious about the options that you have. So you must and make a decision based on the options that you have. Yes, any other thought?
And the going credit, put it in like a one-word summary, I guess, and say,
Yes, yes, that's an accurate one sentence comment. And yes, whether you're basically following the steps without being aware of it or automatically, or whether you're aware of what's happening. So this idea of unconscious is usually associated with Sigmund Freud, that had these categorizations of conscious, subconscious, unconscious, and had this example of like a tip of the iceberg that we see a little bit of it on above the water level, but most of this ice is below the water level. So it's basically what we see on the surface is not necessarily what can be seen or what exists. But years before that, as far as I can say, Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, had this idea, did not formulate it in a way of naming it conscious, unconscious, like Freud did, but I would say that this categorization is credited with both of these figures. So if you think about it, usually, not always, often, training makes this transition from the conscious toward the unconscious. So usually when you're starting to learn something, or when you're starting practicing something, you're not that much familiar with it, you're conscious of all the actions, all the decisions, all the moves that you make. And as you learn more, things become more automatic. You just begin to do it without knowing how you're doing it. It becomes automatic. And this is not just for tasks that you have in mind, like driving, riding a bicycle, but for most other things. From managing an organization, talking to people, making certain types of decisions, dealing with certain situations. As you learn more, things become more unconscious and you do them without being aware of how you're doing them. So, for example, novices or novice pilots usually are always conscious about their every action. But more experienced people or experts act, decide, and behave mostly unconsciously. And for most of them, most of those experts or experienced people, again, I should repeat, if you ask them how you're doing that, they might tell you certain things, but basically they might say, I don't know how I do it, but I do it. So just like, as I said, novices will tell you step-by-step things they do in performance, but when you ask experts, they have no idea. They get confused even. This even might negatively affect their performance when experts become or try to become conscious of their activities. That's something that might happen to certain things like dancing, for example, or playing piano. Because focusing on the steps would further distract that expert and might interfere with their performance. The main reason is that because the skills are in the unconscious of experts. Just like the example that I gave, think about professional dancers. As they start learning dancing, they're always conscious of their moves, how they walk or move their body, but then they get easily tuned with the music or anything that they should do, and they just do it unconsciously, especially for more experienced or professional ones. Or another example is even mathematics. You might think that doing mathematics or sitting in mathematics classes, it's a very super conscious thing. But for more experienced mathematicians or experts, this is not the case. They even follow their steps or rules of mathematics unconsciously. It's a matter of practice. And they might just take a general look at an equation and they have certain feelings about that, or they know something is not right with that equation or something like that. So this is all unconscious. They might become subconscious at a certain point, but that constitutes a small part of their performance. So it's, if you ask more experienced or expert mathematicians, they would tell you that it's more like an art than cold mathematics. They see it as an art. Or pianists. This is the typical example of how a pianist, especially professional pianists, when you watch their performance, it's like a robot or a machine is playing that. It's unbelievable how they're moving their hand and fingers. Do you have any question about this difference between conscious and unconscious, and how conscious becomes unconscious as the person gains more skill? Okay, so now based on whatever we just talked about, why shouldn't we just have experts design training? Yes?
And they said, you know, and they might, like we just talked about, since they're doing it as a consciously, they might do something for an hour, and something a little less so effective in the long run. Because they're not thinking about everything, so anything little that they are doing, they may not even implement it.
Yes, exactly. And you said your name?
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Yes, that's exactly the case, because the detail of their performance of experts is something that they are not aware, at least the detail. Even sometimes it might be some critical behaviors that they might have that they might miss when they want to say or discuss that to an others. Any other? Yes?
I think it's fine. And I think that the other thing that following when that on how to approach and you can want that step by step.
Yes, it's a good point, because usually experts do not think in terms of step-by-step things, or even if they follow certain steps that is shared between many experts, they do not care about steps, or they might even forget about steps. But trainees need the steps, at least in their initial learning of the skill. They need to know what steps should be followed.
Raise a woman, and even if experts are necessarily whatever skill is trying to be taught, that doesn't necessarily mean experts have a skill for teaching. And they may just be fully prepared to guide someone into picking up that skill.
Yes, exactly. Just because you're good at doing something, just because you're expert, doesn't mean you're a good teacher in that, or you doesn't mean you're a good trainer, or you know about the steps of training or the science of training or steps of, like, for example, part test training or any strategy that we use in training, that might not be a knowledge that experts have. And they just do their task. They're not teachers. Yes,
Tom, I think part of it might be a big part of mindset. He likes, he gets how nonsense thing. You know, when you train someone to be a fun mechanic, as an expert fun mechanic, you might say, oh, I need the puzzle speech, right? You know what that is, but they train on.
yes. Yes, and usually experts are not aware of what trainees do not know. They think, okay, this is like conventional thing that everyone should know in our business, but they don't know that someone from outside doesn't even know the basics or certain things that might seem so basic or so easy for them. That's another factor. They might overestimate other people. Did you have any?
I was just gonna go all the way back to the concept of task analysis and breaking everything down to the very basic step. They're so used to, like, take math, for example, usually start out learning how to do it the long way, and then you're taught the shortcuts. So these experts are used to just taking the shortcuts rather than knowing step by step, rather than breaking it down into the individual most basic steps.
Yes, yes, exactly. Because usually those with much experience or those who are experts are not necessarily the ones that would follow certain established norms in many tasks. They might be, their performance might be unconventional. And so they're not even, it's not sometimes, it depends on the task, but for certain tasks, it's not a good idea to start with just training novices from the standpoint of a person who's been there for years and now is, as you said, using shortcuts, for example. It's even detrimental to training. Yes, it depends on the task, but basically, these are the reasons that we do not depend on experts. And another following question is that, does that mean we should just ignore experts entirely, or we can still use them? And if we can still use them, how? Yes.
We would want to assume, for like experts, important to the field to normal people, assume they're an expert in like being an astronaut. We wouldn't want to be head of a training program. We want to pass that on to someone who understands the concepts theoretically. We also need that astronaut input to check everything that person is putting.
Yes. For at least for things like checking or giving feedback on the training or how the training is being conducted or the critical points in performance, things like that, the presence and opinion of experts are usually very important and necessary for developing a training program. Again, it highly depends on the nature of the task, the type of task that we are talking about. But and experts might be observed, might be video recorded, their performance might be recorded in some way or other. But it all depends on what kind of task and how you want to use experts. Usually for most tasks, experts are in critical tasks. Experts do not design the training, but they are often consulted with during the development of training programs, simulators, or anything. So yes, we use experts, but we do not solely depend on them just to do all steps of developing the training. And in answering that question, in short, because experts are often unconscious of the details of their own performance. Now, we might have an expert who is also a good trainer, but this might be because that expert has passed through certain stages of learning how to train that skill. It's not just because they're expert, they can teach. And that is the reason that we need training scientists or psychologists or educational psychologists to be independent observers, being familiar with the principles of training and human skill acquisition from one side, and to have some familiarity with the task, the detail of the task, and consult with experts or subject matter experts, as we call it. So if you have a training scientist, and that training scientist, of course, doesn't know about all skills in the world, but that person knows how to do that. And that is how they do that. They use experts in some certain ways and use their own knowledge of human psychology to design training, considering trainees, their characteristics, the task analysis, and all other details. So this kind of defines the independence of and necessity of people who are training scientists or educational psychologists who design training programs. Now, just as general things, a general statement, especially because of what we talked about for your daily activities and the way that it affects your future performance in any way, just it's helpful to think about what you do on a daily basis in your hobbies, activities, whether it's watching movies, playing an instrument, or anything. And at the same time, thinking about the kind of jobs that you want to have in future. See whether you want to become good at that job or whether that job is suitable for you, and to derive the characteristics of what determines an expert or an experienced person in that job, and see if your current interests and activities have anything to do with that or matches that. It's just a comment. It's like in a parenthesis, just as something that as a suggestion that I have. So do you have any question about why experts shouldn't be used in developing training and any of that? No. Yes.
We have outsiders and experts collaborate on developing a program.
So we ask experts to develop a training program.
I mean, collaborating with like an observer.
Yes, that's what we try to say, that they have to collaborate, they have to be consulted with. And their presence is often necessary, but we shouldn't just depend on them. What we wanted to emphasize is that because someone is an expert in a task, he shouldn't be just the one who develops a training program for that task. His knowledge is definitely useful, is crucial in most of the training. So there must be a collaboration between them and the training scientists. Any other question? Okay, so now we want to continue that block of your transfer that we talked about in last session. So if you remember, we said that those who believe in near transfer usually use high fidelity systems or believe in the effectiveness of high fidelity systems. And they do not, usually by default, they don't like low fidelity systems. They think it's not helpful in training simply because there aren't many identical elements between the training materials and target system or target environment. And this was the example that we reviewed last time, that a high fidelity system is better because it's more similar to the target system and environment than a medium or low fidelity system. Simply because this has more shared features or elements with this. So there are some psychological, or there's a basic psychological assumption for near transfer. And the assumption is important to remember. And that assumption is that mental space or psychological space corresponds to the physical space. Can anyone tell me what this means? Yes.
Our method has, I would say it's a kind of the relationship between nature and nurture. So if the environment has some sort of platform, if you're in a certain environment, it will positive, it will have a lot of influence on how you think about it.
So just to clarify here, by psychological space, we just mostly think about like scale of human activity or human skills. And we are thinking about like difference of certain human skills, say playing chess, solving math, riding bicycle or anything of that kind from the psychological space. These are all skills in the psychological space. And on the other side, we have physical space, like an automobile or simulator, how much they are similar or different. And we want to see whether there is a correspondence between these two, mental space and physical space. And that's why we use the term near transfer, because it believes that these two should be similar, or usually the skills in human mind or psychology, two skills are, or the distance between two skills corresponds with whatever is in the real world. Like a high fidelity simulator looks very much like the target system. And the same goes in human mind. If we develop skill in that high fidelity simulator, that skill is very close to the skill in like a real automobile or the target system. So any other thought on mental space or psychological space? Or have you ever heard of that in this or any other context? Yes.
Take an example, one of the aspect of the job, think about that psychologically. I think about some veterans, like that, certain sounds and things like that, psychologically reminds them of the physical things they do, what happened in the past.
Yes, exactly. Like your past experiences or whatever you did in the past, or whether that's a skill or an experience that you have had, a traumatic experience or anything of that kind that might trigger some responses in future. That is also something that is in your unconscious, is in your psychological, is in your mind or psychology, and you're always with that. And that's relevant to what we discussed before this, that anything you do, any place that you've been, anything that happened to you is with you. So yes, if you think about, like, from this perspective, human mind has a certain space. And there are activities in this space, there are things in this space. And the belief in near transfer says that whatever is in the real world, you see two things are similar, our experience or our psychology or our mind of those two things is also similar. So if you think about the relationship between two skills, like playing chess and math, for example, the transfer between those two skills or the relationship between those two skills in the psychological space is as strong as the relationship in the world, whether we see them similar or not. And you should keep in mind that this is not truth, this is the assumption of those who believe in near transfer. So, for example, if you think about troubleshooting a system like a printer, then that skill that you develop here is transferable to some similar system that even look similar in the physical world. There are similar features between them, identical elements between them. And because in the world they look like each other, in human mind, the skills that you develop in one is transferred to the other. But because this is much different from troubleshooting a mechanical system, like a vehicle, this is not transferred that much to this system. So there might be certain aspects of troubleshooting in general shared between electrical and mechanical systems, but in this context, those who believe in the near transfer would say that this skill would only be transferred to this and might not, or very small amount of transfer to this. Or as a different example in the world of sports, if we have people who are expert in running 200-meter, their skill in 200 can still be transferred to 100-meter running, but not to 10,000-meter running. These two skills have still a lot of things in common. They are more strength related, but this one is more stamina. Is usually, even in the physical terms, there is sharp difference in the structure of the body of people who are in 100 or 200-meter running compared to those who run 10,000. So, the question is that if you think about the assumption of the near transfer, or if you think identical elements theory, just like what we talked about last time, can we say, like, this might be for some people a conventional thing, or some people might believe in it still, that whether playing chess has anything to do or develop skills or transferable skills for people to do mathematics or to mathematical skills? Do you think it's accurate or not, and why? At least just put your own belief aside and assume near transfer and identical elements theory. Yes.
I would say in support of the accuracy of the statement, I want to say that chess does somewhat help and the same skills to mathematics for quick problem solving skills in terms of what you're given dynamically.
So in this context, you think because there are certain things or certain aspects of the task in performance that's similar between the two, like problem solving or certain steps to follow, or certain aspects, they can be considered as transferable from the view of near transfer. Any other thought?
Still requires
a beautiful, beautiful thing, chess, but I would imagine, they would have to walk these steps through it, and have for actually something roots,
Hmm. Okay, and your name? Okay. So, yes, because you can think of certain, or these two activities might be categorized under same general domain of logical activities. And because both of them follow certain logical steps or certain rules, one can say that they are transferable. Again, I should emphasize that think in terms of near transfer. Yes.
Because these tasks are, these tasks or these skills are implemented so differently, even if there is a crossover in maybe certain methods of thinking or taking up steps. There's not enough similarities in how you go about to say skill and transfer that.
Yes, that's another thought, that because usually their implementation and their practice is different from one another, at least from the perspective of near transfer, they are not transferable, or skills in one is not transferred to the other. Any other thought? So the answer is no. And I would say I'm giving a definitive answer. Sometimes the answer is not as definitive as here, but in the context of near transfer, from the perspective of near transfer, and if you think about the belief in near transfer, there should be many identical elements or identical features between these two tasks of playing chess and doing math. And because you cannot, at least on the surface, find these similarities, the skill in one is not transferable to the skill in the other. Now, you might search the literature of psychology, and there might be some scientists investigating that and finding some evidence. But again, here we are teaching what people who believe in near transfer think. And from that perspective, we will discuss that later, that those who believe, those who are in the opposite side, believe in far transfer, might not only think about this, but even some much more dissimilar things that you might possibly think of. So